relationship that she has with her grandmother. She's getting ready to graduate high school, doesn't really know what she wants to do, but she's going to be taking a trip to Europe with her grandmother to kind of see where she grew up when she was in her 20s. Unfortunately, at the end of the chapter, you find out that her grandmother has taken a fall and is being admitted to the hospital. So that's kind of the transition that we're headed into for chapter 2. You also kind of are introduced to the poor relationship she has with her sister and kind of disconnected relationship she has with her mother. So, that being said, let's hop in. Chapter 2. When we arrived in the ICU, it wasn't long before I remembered why I despised hospitals so much. The air hung heavy with the smell of medicine, sickness, and death, and I rarely took into account that this was the same place that babies would take their first breath of life. The hall swarmed with doctors buried in clipboards, nurses toting carts of needles, and families carrying flowers or balloons for their loved ones. Meanwhile, I sat impatiently in the waiting room, consistently changing positions in an uncomfortable, ghastly green chair while I observed the rest of my family. Nell had her face buried in one of my father's broad shoulders as they sat on the matching green sofa across from me. He rubbed circles on her back, soothing her like a child while she sobbed uncontrollably. Over in the corner, my mother had resumed her pacing, biting her nails and every so often glancing at her cell phone to ensure she was still available for work emergencies. I took a deep breath and let out a long sigh, unsure of how much more of this I could take. It felt as if we'd been here forever with no updates to Graham's condition, and the only time we'd left was to grab a small bite to eat in the cafeteria. It wasn't as if any of us were actually hungry. Sadness had a way of destroying an appetite. Standing up to stretch my legs, I grabbed a magazine from one of the racks hanging on the wall just as one of the doctors walked into the room. "Mrs. Mosley, I'd like to speak with you in private about your mother for a moment," he told her. "Mr. Mosley, if you could join us as well." My father stood and the three of them departed from the room, leaving us there to assume the absolute worst. Obviously, no one would need to speak in private if the news were as simple as to say that she was recovering nicely and would be released before the end of the week. "I don't see why the doctor couldn't just tell us all what's happening," Nell mentioned as she directed her gaze to the muted TV in the corner. "It's not as if we're children." I glanced over to see an ad listing all of the side effects to an anxiety medication and thought it best to stay quiet. While merely agreeing with Nell seemed safe, I'd fallen victim to that same type of trap in the past. She would say something that seemed conversational and friendly, and then once I'd respond, she would find a way to rake me over the coals. "He didn't seem bothered about talking in front of me when you weren't here yet," she went on despite my silence. "Maybe he thinks you look too young to face the harsh news of what is probably inevitable." I couldn't fail to recognize the fact that she'd tried to insult me, but I'd been too distracted by her insinuation to care. "What's so inevitable?" I asked curiously. When she turned to look at me, her eyes were bright red, circles with dark marks of mascara, and for just a moment, our sadness gave us something in common. "Before you got here, the doctor told us that she'd been lashing out hysterically. I think they gave her some sort of sedative to calm her." Goosebumps trailed down my arms. "Did he say what she was freaking out about?" Nell swallowed hard, more tears welling in her eyes. "He said that she'd kept claiming she saw her husband." "Her husband?" I frowned. "Gramps is never married. Do you think she was talking about—" "Grandpa, you idiot," she said angrily, and all of a sudden my sympathy for her went completely out the window. Haven't you ever heard that when people are close to death, they start to see their dead loved ones? No, I admitted, but in my defense, I'd also never really experienced death before. My grandfather was shot during a gas station robbery before I was born, and although Nell seems to make it like she remembered him, she was only 3 and could barely remember her own birthday. Wait, are you implying that she's... I couldn't manage the words. Do you think she's... Yes, Celine, she said, knowing what I'd been trying so hard to say. And honestly, you should probably start trying to make peace with it. There's only a 60% survival rate with brain aneurysms, and of those, 66% have permanent neurological defects. She's gonna be fine, I muttered, grabbing a magazine and making my way over to a couch farther away from her. Grams was the strongest person I knew, super feisty and full of life. Something as simple as a fall wasn't gonna take her from me. You're in denial, kid, Nell said, shaking her head. Don't you get it? Even if she makes it through this, she'll never be the same. Graham will never be Graham again. Guess you're gonna have to start paying attention to the rest of your family now. I shot a glare over in her direction, but she'd already turned her attention back to the TV, and I pretended to be interested in the pages that I continued to flip through. Nevertheless, it frustrated me that she had the audacity to accuse me of not paying attention to a family that had never paid attention to me. My mother and father had always made over Nell. She was the firstborn, the straight-A student, the golden child, and the one that never did anything wrong. Yeah, she had a bit of a nasty attitude from time to time, but according to my parents, she had more on her plate than most people her age, because she was going to school to be a prestigious lawyer someday. One of the many reasons that Graham and I had grown so close was because she watched me while the rest of my family went to all of Nell's big events. Spelling bees, honor roll awards, even math camp. And I probably could have tagged along or stayed home with my parents while my sister was away, but I never saw a point. When I was around, I felt invisible to them, and Grams did things with me. She took me places, played games with me, and treated me like a human being with thoughts and feelings and emotions instead of some silly child. I muddled over it for some time, going back and forth with myself until my parents returned a few hours later to tell us that Graham was ready to see us. In the end, I decided that I wasn't going to apologize for being so close to her, and for having an unbreakable bond and friendship with someone who openly showed me on a daily basis how much she truly cared. She may not be awake, my mother was saying with some difficulty, but if she is, then she can probably hear you. Her voice cracked and her shoulders trembled as my father wrapped his arm around her waist. I recommend telling her anything final that you may want her to know. My father handed her another tissue before he looked up at us, both of us standing in front of them now. We have to make a few phone calls and start working on arrangements, so we'll meet you girls at home a little later. He pulled Nell and me into an awkward family hug before escorting my mother out of the room and down the hallway to the hospital elevator. I watched as they left, entering the elevator and pressing a button before I noticed the man standing behind them. He'd been inside when the doors had opened, but he hadn't gotten off. There was something uncanny about him, enough that he'd caught my attention, and he wore a black suit, matching tie, and dark-shaded glasses. Standing with his hands resting down in front of him, he looked like a member of Secret Service or security for some VIP, but people like that didn't reside around Omni, and I couldn't help being leery of his presence. You go ahead, I told Nell, not waiting to hear what she had to say. I was already racing down the opposite half of the corridor to a set of large windows, curious to see if the man would be in the parking lot somewhere, and hoping to get a better look. It took a few minutes, but when I finally spotted him coming out of the exit doors, a frown creased my brow. Following closely behind him, and seemingly deep in conversation with him, were both of my parents. Since it did occur to me that they may have simply struck up a friendly conversation in the elevator, I continued to watch them, all three having stopped just outside. The strange man threw glances around the parking lot, his mouth moving every so often to respond to whatever it was that my parents may have been saying, when an unfamiliar black down car pulled up in front of them. It sat there for a moment while I assumed they finished their conversation. The windows tinted too dark to see inside, but just as I thought the man was going to climb into the back seat, he waited. He scoured the area with his eyes as he held the door for my parents, while they got in instead. Chills ran down my spine as I watched them pull away, multiple questions running through my head as I sat down on the window ledge. What were my parents up to? Who was in the car? I started to create answers in my mind, each one more suspicious and accusatory than the last, while my imagination ran on overdrive. Was Graham's fall more than just an accident? For each question that I asked myself, another one came. What are you doing over here? I jumped a mile at the sound of Nell's voice. I didn't know what to say. I knew I couldn't tell her what I'd seen. She would undoubtedly say that I was being paranoid and insist there was a logical explanation. Maybe there was, but I didn't want her asking questions before I could find out. Wait, why are you with Graham? Her face instantly softened. I've said all I needed to say, she told me as tears began to fill her eyes. Plus, it's getting late. I wanted to make sure that you got some time with her before visiting hours are over. I hadn't even realized how quickly the time had flown. The sun had disappeared from the sky, replaced by the fluorescent lights cast over the hospital parking. I appreciate that, I said genuinely when I looked up to see her quickly wiping the dampness from her cheeks. Are you going home? She nodded, scurrying over to engulf me in a hug as I stood up. It was a surprising gesture, one that made me feel unsure of what to do, almost as if I'd forgotten how compassion worked. Maybe it was because I couldn't remember the last time Nell had shown me any, or maybe it was because every time that she did, there was an awful comment or action that followed to contradict it. Call if you need anything, she whispered before she let me go. My arms still dangled at my sides. She's in room 209. Taking a deep breath when we parted ways at the door, I sauntered slowly toward Graham's room. My feet were heavier than normal and my lungs felt like they were filled with lead. I couldn't help wondering if this would be the last time that I would see her, talk to her, hug her, or hold her hand, and the thought overwhelmed me. How could we be planning a trip, laughing and discussing simple things like tea with friends and dinner reminders just a few hours ago? And now here I was preparing to what? Say goodbye forever? It occurred to me then that I was shaking my head as I turned the knob of the door to her room, tapping lightly as I walked inside and then closing it behind me. I refused to believe that anything bad would happen to her. Not right now. Not tonight. And even when I turned to look at her lying lifeless in her hospital bed, I told myself that she would be all right. Graham, I whispered as I approached, quickly taking note of the tubes and needles that protruded sickly from her nose, mouth, and arms. Her delicate pink skin seemed almost yellow, and her whole left side was covered in bruise, not to be overshadowed by the large gash that ran down the length of her cheekbone just under her eye. Graham, it's Sal, I whispered again, taking one of her hands in mine as her eyelids began to flutter. Can you hear me? I was a bit skeptical, but to my surprise, she slowly opened her eyes, gradually revealing the bright green color of them that matched mine. It was one of the only things we had in common, our eyes and high cheekbones. The rest of my genes had come from the Mosley side, and for the first time in my life, I was oddly sad that I didn't look more like her. There you are. I smiled down at her as she watched me, seeming a bit more uncomfortable with the tube that ran from her throat. I wasn't completely sure of what I should say. Everything that came to mind seemed foolish or petty, and because there was no real words that could describe how I found myself babbling. I wish there was something that I could do to fix this, I told her as I rushed to swallow the lump that threatened to form in my throat. If I could take the pain away or go back in time, I would just... She squeezed my hand and I paused, observing the way that she closed her eyelids and moved her head to the side ever so slightly. I knew it was her way of trying to tell me that there was nothing I could do, that I was being silly, and what was done was done. I gave her a bit of an understanding nod. I know, don't dwell, right? A soft chuckle escaped to me and I shrugged. What can I say? Sometimes I can't help it. I traced my finger down the soft and fragile outline of one of the veins in her arms. It's not all bad, though. Things that happened in the past, reminiscing, like the bedtime stories you used to tell me when I was a child. I reminded her excitedly. It could be 4 o'clock in the afternoon and I would be ready to go to bed just so that I could hear them. And the fact that they were true stories only made them more magical for me, you know? I'd lie awake for hours after you left my room, replaying them over and over in my head, picturing every detail just as you described them, and sometimes, when I knew you'd gone home and everyone was asleep, I'd get up and dance around my room pretending I was there with you. At the grand opening ball of the hotel in Paris, the opera with the Duke of Arlington and Covent Garden, the International Jazz Festival in Spain. I almost convinced myself that I was there for all of those moments with you. In fact, my eyes drifted away from hers. I actually thought we'd revisit those places when we finally went to Europe together. Only, for real this time. Scattered someplace in the midst of it all, I'd started to tremble, and I held tightly to the bed rail with my free hand, trying to make it stop. I need you to promise me something, Gramps, I told her as I looked deep into her eyes. If you can't make the trip... I had to stop myself, letting out a long sigh to keep from crying. If you can't be there physically, then just promise me that you'll be there the way I was, dancing around in the dark somewhere, but still with me in spirit. Tears welled in her eyes, and when she blinked, one of them fell wistfully down her cheek. Now don't think that gives you a free pass, I added. You're gonna make it through this. I'll be right here with you for all of it. She settled her head back into the pillow, and though her eyes were wet, I could tell they were smiling just before she closed them. I love you, Graham, I told her as I clung to her, hugging her tightly and not wanting to let go. Part of me was afraid that if I did, she would slip away somehow. I pulled the chair up next to the bed and laid my head in her lap, praying that it wouldn't end. I needed her to keep breathing, to just keep sleeping, and to keep holding on despite her exhaustion. I observed the steady movement of her chest, rhythmical and soothing, feeling for her pulse every now and then just to ensure that my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. With every passing hour, I felt like there was hope that she would make it to another day, and with every passing hour, my eyelids grew heavier. Gramps, I'm gonna get some coffee, okay? I'll be right back. I knew she was probably asleep, but in the event that she wasn't, I wanted her to know that I wasn't leaving her. Besides, I'd only be gone for a second. Getting up as quietly as possible, I headed out to the waiting room where the bright lights shone on a freshly brewed pot. I did everything as quickly as I could. Poured the cup, added creamer, added sugar, and stirred. Blowing on the top, I took a sip to check that the contents were as I liked them. Perfect. I wasn't gone long, 15 minutes maximum, but the truly wretched thing about this thing called death is that it doesn't wait. It's a silent thief that sneaks up on you in the night and shows no remorse for what it's done, about to do, or is doing. When I got back to the room, I'd only just arrived to see Graham's falling victim to it. What is she doing in here? Get her out! One of the doctors yelled from where he was positioned at the side of her bed, and the nurse next to him rushed at me obediently, spilling my coffee as she scooted me back toward the door. More voices sounded from inside. Ventricular tachycardia, one shouted. Machines beeped, and I could hear clanging trays. What happened to the vent? Blood pressure dropping, came another, and I made an attempt to push my way back in. I need to be with her, I pleaded, But the nurse shook her head and continued to push back. "She's a DNR," I heard them say. "There's nothing we can do." My legs were slowly transforming into what felt like cooked noodles, and it was getting harder to fight against the weight of the woman I struggled to barge past. She was bigger than me, much bigger, and her arms were wrapped around me, blockading my sight to what lay behind her. I struggled, flailing helplessly while my face melted and my heart broke. "It's over. She's gone." Those words knocked the wind out of me, and I stood there for a moment staring into the face of the nurse, out of breath and out of time. The solid beep that I could recall from the movies when a character died suddenly became ever so real to me. Just one solid sound ringing in my ears. Time of death, 9:06 p.m. That was the last thing I heard as I slid down the wall next to room 209, staring straight ahead with empty eyes and a heavy heart. I'm not sure why, but my whole body just went numb. I couldn't feel anything, see anything, hear anything, and the only thing that continually ran through my head was that maybe if I'd still been there, she still would